Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for Parish Resource Center's workshop on Introduction to Grant Writing. I want to thank the Lancaster County Community Foundation for underwriting this series so we can offer the whole thing free of charge. Tonight we have with us Susanna Connor. She's a grant writer and development consultant based in Pocatello, Idaho, and we're so glad she's able to join us tonight. As we go through the workshop, when you have questions, please chat them to me at any point. I will organize those a bit and try to group questions together and ask them of Susanna as we go. If you're not sure how to chat, if you see your menu on Zoom, one of those options is to chat, and that will open up a little box that will allow you to chat your questions to me. And go ahead and give it a try as a little introduction. Why don't you all chat to me what organization you're representing tonight? That'll give us a little bit of an idea who is in our audience. But I will give the time to Susanna and let her get going. I know that we have a lot to cover, and I also suspect we're going to have a lot of questions that we want to get through tonight. So, Susanna?
Thanks, Rhoda. Hi, everybody. My name is Susanna. It's lovely to be with you this evening. I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. You might find when I share my screen that you are suddenly forced to only look at my screen. But if you go up into the top left of Zoom, you can select your viewing options, and you can also see the chat or just part of the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and get that going. All right. Okay, so this is kind of a unique information session because it is part workshop. I'm going to be walking you through kind of a very rough crash course in what the parts of grant writing and the parts of a grant writing program for your organization might look like. This is specially designed for faith communities and small nonprofits. So ideally organizations that are small enough that they don't have their own grant writing or development or fundraising staff. As Rhoda said, I am a grant writer by trade. I work with cooperatives and nonprofits and faith communities to sort of navigate this weird space between being an organization that's big enough to have a development person, a full-time development person, and not, because it's very difficult for, I think, executive directors or pastors or chairs of boards to think about grant writing when you have so many other things going on. So the cohort that we are going to be talking about is it's a 4-week cohort that PRC is going to be offering. So after this information session, you'll have an opportunity to apply to say that you would like to join the cohort and go through a longer process of learning to write grants and implement some grant writing practices in your organization. So I just wanted to share a brief outline of what that workshop is going to look like. I've split it up into 4 pieces where we identify the projects, we identify the funders, we identify the narrative, and then a week on structure, planning, and execution. So best practices for planning, workflow, communications, financials, submission, and grant reporting. So kind of a catch-all for some of the things that we might not get to in the other sections. And then in the middle there, between April 5th and May 3rd, all the teams who participate will schedule a one-on-one with me where we can kind of go over your particular needs. I just want to say that this is a workshop. It's not going to be 4 weeks on just sort of grant writing in general, we are actually going to talk about your projects, your mission statements, the things you want to do. We're going to try to find funders for your projects, work through actual questions on the applications that you're working through, and hopefully submit some grants. So this evening, to kind of walk us through the process and give you all a sense of what the cohort is going to be like, I thought we would do a little case study where we are going to take on a client together. There is really nothing more boring than talking about grant writing in the abstract. What makes grant writing interesting is what it makes possible for real people in real situations. So we are gonna use a little case study example to sort of walk through and see the sorts of things that we are going to work through in the cohort. And I'm hoping that this will open up questions, wonderings that you have about your faith communities, your small nonprofits. So take notes, ask questions in the chat. We will get to them at the end. So we are taking on a client. This client has a nonprofit in Lancaster County. This is Lou Diamond Phillips. He is the executive director of a nonprofit called TEEN. I don't know what TEEN stands for. He did not tell me. TEEN is a 501c3 organization. It has 5 years of financials. It has a board and 2 part-time employees besides Lou, who is full-time. And their mission statement is serving the youth of Lancaster County through education, safety, and justice initiatives. This is what we're going to be doing. I know it's a little silly, but try to put yourselves in the shoes of the client. And sometimes I find that looking at something from a distance helps us ask better questions of ourselves. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to get into, we want to sit down with Lou and find out how he approaches fundraising and development. So for Lou, when he is working on fundraising and development, he relies heavily on his board and his employees. These are the stakeholders, right? These are the people who have a vested interest in the activities of the nonprofit. Because he is a small nonprofit who serves the community, he also has a really robust volunteer base, and he tries to keep the volunteers involved in the types of things that he's pursuing, right? So the sort of fundraising, the goals of the fundraising and the development. And that's really good. When we are casting large, broad visions for the types of projects that we would like to fund through grants, it's very important to get the buy-in of our board, our employees, and our volunteers, our congregations, right? We need to make sure that we are not just working on our own because we think it's a really, really great idea, but we're just out here by ourselves. These are sort of the people that Lou has to consult with when he's making large-scale decisions. And, you know, the sorts of things that your board, your employees, your volunteers, your congregation are useful for is community connections, right? All these people live and work in Lancaster County. They're going to be able to connect the nonprofit to opportunities. Business experience, again, these people live and work in Lancaster County. They're going to bring different skills to the table. And funding opportunities. It is very difficult. I saw as folks were signing up for this workshop, a lot of people were asking, where do I find funding opportunities? And a lot of that happens through conversation with people that you already know. So Lou is going to want to keep open lines of communication, right, with his board, his employees, his volunteers. When it comes time to actually write a grant, though, if Lou tries to involve all of these people in the minutia of grant writing, it is going to be horrible, and everyone is going to be mad, and nothing is going to get accomplished. So we are going to want to sit Lou down, and we are going to want to talk about building a grants team. So for faith communities and nonprofit organizations that are too small to have dedicated grant writing staff, it's important to cultivate a small grants team that can divide responsibility and provide accountability in the fundraising process. And so Lou is going to look to his staff, his board, his volunteers, his dedicated community members, and try to put together a team of maybe 2 to 4 people who collectively possess the skills it takes to create and submit, execute, and report on successful grants. So Lou, if he's being really honest with us and with himself, he's a visionary, he's a really good leader, and he's the one who has the narrative, right? So the deep knowledge of his organization's history, mission, and programs. But I'm sure we all know an executive director like this. When it comes time for him to sit down and write that email or write that grant application, he just has too much to say, and he just doesn't really care about punctuation. And so he's going to call upon Kiefer, who is his part-time administrator, but who also just happens to have incredible organization skills and editorial skills. So Kiefer is the person who keeps the calendars, he keeps people on track, he's really good at tasks and checklists, but he also loves the English language and is very, very good at editing. So Kiefer is going to be a key person to have involved in the grants writing process. And then neither of these guys are really good at money. So they're going to call upon Emilio, who's a board member, but he's also a certified personal accountant in Lancaster. And Emilio is fantastic with budgets and all of the computer software, right? The computer literacy that one needs to do that in 2022, but then also just general rule following. I can't tell you how many grant makers I talk to who they just lament, right? That this organization had a great idea, but they just didn't follow the instructions, right? Whether it was getting something in on time, answering the questions as they were asked, or just including the attachments that they ask for. So you're going to want to make sure that you have a rule follower. Now, the members of your grants team do not have to contribute equally to the process. It's very likely that you're going to have one person who holds, most of the responsibility for writing the grant, but make sure that you spread out the work. You can write grants all by yourself. You will burn out. It is a lot of work. And then once you start winning those grants and you have to keep track of things and report on them, the job becomes quite big. So getting a good grants team in place before you ever start grant writing is a huge asset. So then in the first week of the workshop, we would sit down with Lou and Kiefer and Emilio, the grants team for teen. And we are going to ask them to look at their existing programs, their service track record, and the needs of their constituents, right? We're going to ask them to list their key essential program areas. We want to know what teen does and what teen does well. So teen offers weekly homework help. They do work with engaging teens in local politics. They offer small scholarships for learning opportunities. They offer weekly self-defense classes, and they coordinate big community service projects. So this is what teen actually does. It's important to be really honest with yourself, with your grants team, about what you actually do before you sit down and try to find funders who, right? Because grant makers are trying to fund very specific things often. And it can be tempting to see a request for proposals from a grant maker, and it's asking for something that you just don't do. And it can be tempting to say, like, well, we can do that, right? It's going to be very hard to convince that grant maker, even though you have traditionally done one thing, that now that there's a lot of money involved, you're going to change your whole mission. Which, besides the fact, Lou doesn't want to change his mission. He's happy with what he does. So then we're going to want to ask Lou the question, what are your constituents asking for? What is your board asking for? What are the big dreams that have sort of been on the horizon for your organization that you might think about securing grant funding for? So the first one is build a skate park. It's what the kids are all asking for. Would you build us a skate park? The second one is there are a couple people on the board who would really love to see teen hold a college fair. And third, there have been some incidents, some increased incidents of violence against teenagers in downtown Lancaster, in dimly lit areas. And there have been, the board has sort of pointed out, like maybe this is something that we should start a campaign to increase downtown lighting. So what we're going to do, because this is our client, is sort of help them look at these options and look at their priorities and say, which one is the best fit for what we do right now? So build a skate park actually doesn't really cross over any of the existing program areas of teen, maybe community service. But we're talking about owning property, maintenance, lots of safety regulations. This is just not something that teen as an organization is big enough to support. They're going to be honest about that with themselves. They're not going to do it right now. Maybe it's a dream for 5 or 10 years down the road. Hold a college fair. A lot of organizations are already holding college fairs, right? High schools are holding them. Local universities are holding them. This is not the best use of teens' time. And so rather than reinventing the wheel, what teen might do is go to another organization that holds a great college fair, and they might team up on maybe just bringing their kids, right, on a certain day. The third being increased downtown lighting. As you talk with Amelia O'Keefer and Lou, you see that this actually crosses their program areas in a few places. It involves political engagement, self-defense, community service. You kind of, maybe this is the sort of thing that you do talk about with your board, with your constituents. Hey, what if we kind of turned our focus to this thing that already kind of is situated in our program areas, a campaign to light downtown Lancaster better. So I think that we've now led our client to a productive, well-supported program. Once you've identified the project, it's going to be important to make sure that, at least in brief, they can answer these questions. What's the need? What are the steps? Who's involved? What's the timeline? And what's the ballpark cost? We're not talking about anything that's written in stone. But, can the 3 people who are closest to this grant, to this project, sort of in an elevator pitch, tell the board, tell a community partner, tell a grantor what it is that they're going to try to do? And again, this might be brainstorming that happens in the larger group, and that is just fine. But we're going to come back to these questions in session 3, but this is what I would want my client to have right out of the gate is you need to be able to answer these questions about your program. So the next time we meet, we are going to work on identifying the funders for this project. So Lou has done no grant writing, and he actually kind of sheepishly wants to know who even gives grants. So we're going to start with sort of in general, big money and work down. In general, oftentimes, biggest money is going to be government grants, especially federal government. Government grants can be hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. They can be huge projects, but they also have a ton of oversight and a ton of reporting. Excuse me. So, for someone who's a first-time grant writer, going for a huge dollar amount with a ton of oversight and reporting, that might be a little bit out of his league. But there are grants.gov is just a database that the government where the government already coordinates and centralizes all the different types of grants that you can get in your geographic area and in your area of service. Next, we have the foundations. So family foundations, corporate foundations, community foundations, social impact funds, which we'll talk about later, other nonprofit fundraising bodies, right? So like the United Way, and then financial, academic, or religious institutions. There are like Christian funds, for example, that will write $1 million grants. So there can be quite a bit of money in these foundations, but it just depends. It depends on what you're trying to fund, and it depends on who you're asking. Sort of my point with this list is to say they're everywhere. And there are lots of places that you can look for these things. Like, for example, your bank, if you went on their website and you typed in, grants in their search bar, many banks, national banks especially, they manage funds for people. So you could search your area in your local bank's database and find out which grants are they managing that you could apply for. And then often, again, not always, but often, smaller dollar amounts, individuals, community groups, and local businesses. So maybe a few hundred or a few $1,000s that these are just kind of smaller funders who are looking to specifically invest in their community. So part of why we asked Lou's team to ballpark the cost of this program is because, as you can see, if you're raising $3,000, you're probably not going to start with the federal government. And if you're raising $300,000, you probably aren't going to start with your local Lions Club. So it's a good idea to sort of have a rough idea of what you're going to be raising before you spend a lot of time writing either grants that are way too big for the grantor to be interested in your project, or way too small to make a dent in your budget. One thing I will say about that, applying for very small grants when you're trying to raise a lot of money might be a good idea if you're trying to build a relationship with the granting organization in the long term. So sometimes funders will offer if you're a first-time applicant, you can only apply for $5,000. But if you apply and you win the grant and then you spend it and you're wonderful, you can apply for 20. So just keeping an eye out for, maybe it's not the amount of money you're looking for, but maybe it's a relationship that you want to cultivate over time. So the questions that we're going to want to ask in relation to funding is approximately how much do we need? Which personal relationships can I cultivate? And when I say that, I mean, and I don't mean this in a cynical way, grant making often has a lot to do with personal relationships. That is not to say that people give grants to their buddies, which I'm sure happens. But if you can let yourself be known to the granting body over time, they will come to trust you, your organization. If ever, a funder is offering an information session, go ask questions. Ask the presenter if you can have a meeting afterwards to just pick their brain on the fund and what sort of projects they're interested in funding. Those personal relationships do actually go quite a long way in the long run. Will timing affect my outcomes? That's just if, Lou is trying to have all of this lighting installed in the downtown in December of 2022. He's not going to want to apply for a grant that doesn't release funds until December of 2022. So, and then do I need a partner? Which we'll come back to that question about community partners. Now, hold on a second. Emilio, our money man, does have one thing to say. There are other ways to raise money, right? So just because you can get grants doesn't mean that you necessarily need to get a grant. Grants have oversight, grants have reporting, grants have a lot of hoops to jump through. If you're looking at a project and you're like, I think that we could just raise that money with a letter writing campaign, then just do a letter writing campaign. I've been hired by a nonprofit to run a Kickstarter. That is another type of fundraising and development work that you might find is a little bit easier, or maybe just a little bit more suited to a project that you are currently pursuing. Okay, a word on community partners. With very few exceptions, partnering with other organizations will strengthen your proposal. I know that it can feel like the world of grant making is competitive. And certainly it is. But for the most part, if you have something that you want to do in Lancaster County, and there is another church or another organization that wants to do something really similar, it's more likely that you two should partner up, right? Pool your resources, pool your assets, and show the grant maker that there is a real need for this, so much so that we've come together, across time and space to write this grant together. You're going to be more likely to get that grant most of the time. So what Lou might do is he might think, are there any schools near downtown that might want to participate in this project? What about a Main Street association or destination marketing organization, which I think a DMO is what y'all have in downtown Lancaster, right? So an organization that is already working on the attractiveness of downtown. Religious institutions. Are there some churches downtown who are going to want to partner on this project? He could also think the other way, which is that, this project is going to require energy. It's going to require lights. It's going to require somebody to install those lights. Maybe there's a utilities or manufacturing company that would partner on this work, not just write a grant for it. Sorry, come back. And then other small nonprofits. So like I said, it might be people who are present in this workshop right now who are the perfect partner for you in pursuing a grant. And like I said, it is just a fantastic way to strengthen your application if you can show that you're not just out here by yourself thinking that it's a good idea, that there are other organizations in town who think that this is a good idea. So the third time we meet with the grants team, we're going to be sitting down with Kiefer and Lou to talk about the narrative. So once you have your program and your potential grantors, you start working on narrative. Most grant applications cover the same territory with like a 10% deviation in the wording of questions and the specific interests of the granting body. So we're not here to rewrite the copy every time we apply for a new grant, but we're going to be paying really close attention to the wording of the questions and the mission of the funder so that we can answer the question in a way that's actually helpful to the granting body. So there are kind of 4 general categories of narrative that we're going to want to work out. The first is history and mission. The second is the program of the project. The third is data. And the fourth is the budget. So history and mission. That is having a strong, pithy mission statement, knowing your founding principles, your history, and then also being able to list your recent accomplishments. The program of the project, you should recognize these questions. What's the need? What are the steps? Who's involved? What's the timeline? So at this point, when we're working on our narrative, we're going to want to really get into the weeds of, in particular, the steps in the timeline, but also who's involved, right? Who are your community partners? Who is going to be doing this work? To whom are you going to be advertising? Data can be a little more daunting. Many funders will ask you questions about, measurements. Sometimes it's like these data-driven questions, and especially if you're working in some sort of, humanitarian philanthropy or even the arts, it can be kind of difficult, right, to wrap your head around, like, how do I answer a question about my data? So a couple things I might suggest is, the first is, are there any peer-reviewed studies that cross over this work? So has anyone done any studies on lighting in downtown areas and decreases in crime, right? That might be a great thing to go research and to include in our grant application so that this doesn't sound like something that we're just making up. There actually is some data behind it. Demographics is something that's asked for a lot in grant applications. So they might want to find out who lives in the area that they're trying to install more lighting in, who owns the businesses, who are the property managers that they're trying to install lights on their buildings, and then the constituent demographics. Who are the teenagers who come to teen? And then the last one that you'll hear this a lot in grant applications, they're going to ask for measurable impacts. Again, just get creative with how would you know if you made a difference in this community? How would you know if your project actually was needed? So I might tell them, can you guys pull the last 12 months, right, of crime statistics? And then after the lights are installed, we're going to look at 12 more months of data, right? It's not perfect science. I've never claimed to be a scientist. And honestly, I don't think many granting bodies are asking you to go hire a scientist, but making some really good faith attempts at showing that what you did made a difference to your community. And then budget. So this is sort of Emilio's realm, but getting, again, very molecular about your budget. Materials and labor. What are we actually talking about here? How much does a light cost? How much is it going to cost to keep that light running? Advertising. What is it going to cost for you to advertise downtown? Staff time, and then overhead. What are the, what portion of running this program is just going to sort of eat into the general activity or into the general resources of team? So a request for proposals is, I don't know if I've said this yet, a request for proposals is what granting bodies put out. We call them RFPs in the biz. RFPs will also ask for some combination of possible attachments. So you probably are going to need, or in some cases, you'll need resume for your staff. In some cases, you will need an organizational chart to show how your staff fits together with your board and your employees. You might need your board members' titles, where they work in the community. You might need to demonstrate demographics for your staff and your board. You're going to need your IRS designation letter. If you are not a 501c3, but you are going to be using a fiscal sponsor, you will need a letter from your fiscal sponsor, right? And you're going to need their EIN, their tax identification number, so that you can prove that they are going to be receiving the money on your behalf. Audited financials. Again, this is if you are your own entity already. Oftentimes they will ask you for your most recent audited financials. If your organization is not old enough to have audited financials, there's usually a way around it. You can usually reach out and explain the situation and they'll give you something else you can submit. But the more types of paperwork you have access to, the better.
Can we go back to the IRS letter quickly? And can you speak, there's a lot of churches that would essentially have a whole denominational letter.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to if that is good, if they would need a separate letter or something on top of that?
Sure. So in the case of churches who are applying for, obviously you're never going to be applying for funding that isn't open to you. So you may find a really promising, you may be a church, you may find a grant that seems really promising. And when you go to look at the grant requirements and it says you must be a designated 501c3 nonprofit, that might just mean that you're out of the running, right? I always encourage asking. Email, there's usually a contact number or a contact email for somebody or a phone number. Call, email, double check, say, hey, we're a church, but this work that we're doing, it's not going to be restricted by religion. Like, will you accept this? So I always favor that sort of like personal intervention on your own behalf, but it might just be that if it requires that you're a 501c3 nonprofit, that you just can't qualify. At the same time, there is a ton of funding out there for religious organizations, and those applications are going to be tailored to the paperwork that you possess. So if it is a denominational letter, right, that just makes official that you are a religious institution as recognized by the federal government, that's going to be enough. Does that answer the question, Rhoda, do you think? Do I need to say?
I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I think the distinction there is, do you qualify based on the requirements that they've listed on their website? And if it seems like a gray area to you, reach out, ask. advocate for yourself always. And I can speak more to fiscal sponsors, but basically it's not unheard of for a church group to encounter a grant that they would like to receive that requires you be a nonprofit. This is where community partnerships come in handy. Approach a local nonprofit who does similar work to the work that you'd like to be doing and propose that you guys go at this together, with the nonprofit being the body who's applying.
And then a
yeah.
question about the audited financials. Is
Mhm.
that an in-house audit, or is that like sent out to like an accounting firm?
When they say audited financials, they mean an accounting firm. This is not all grant applications will ask you for this. This list, what I'm sort of trying to throw out here for you all, for my silly clients from Young Guns, is that the more paperwork that we can gather, the more documentation that we can gather about our organization is going to be better. So if you are an organization that gets your financials audited, make sure that you have those on hand. If for some reason you are not, you will encounter plenty of grants that don't ask you for that. They might just want the previous and current year's budget. That is probably the most common, is going to be just, can you provide your budget from the last fiscal year and your projected budget for this fiscal year? And that does not need to be audited. But if it says audited financials, they do mean out of house. And again, if you don't have that, call them, email, advocate for yourself, say, we don't do that, or we're not old enough. I mean, I've run into that quite a bit with clients where there's not old enough to have some of the types of paperwork that the grantor is asking for. That's fine. Just, get a special dispensation to put your application in. A reminder to reuse your copy. If you're going to apply for 5 grants this year, you do not need to rewrite every time you apply. And then just a quick word on character count, the great heartbreaker. When you download a questions list on a request for proposals, it'll oftentimes say, maximum 500 characters, maximum 500 words. Sometimes a lot of organizations now only accept submissions through a grants portal, right? So like fillable fields. Go ahead and log in before you start writing, because not all granting bodies are doing the work of making sure that they're telling you that there's a character limit or a word limit. So you're going to want to go in and look at each field, right? And see, what does the little field say you can put in that box. Then you're going to go back to your team and you're going to write, and you're not going to write a beautifully crafted 2,000 word answer to a question only to log in and find out that it was actually 2,000 characters. So just keeping an eye on character count or word count will save everyone a lot of sadness. So identify the narrative. We're just going to be describing what we're doing, but then also keeping in mind that there are often going to be attachments. And, a note on attachments, once you've done the work of collecting them, making them look shiny, putting them into PDF form, go ahead and save those in a centralized folder. Don't lose those, because pulling them together every single time is a huge pain. A word on centering equity. How do diversity, equity, and inclusion factor into the world of grant writing and grant making? The other thing that you will often see either in a grant application or requested as an attachment is, something to the effect of your statement of policy and practice with regard to diversity and inclusiveness of your organization. So I think that especially in our world today, we run into requests for things like this a lot, right? Like, what's your statement on DEI? And we can become kind of, it can become just another box that we're trying to check, right? Like, oh yeah, we have that statement. We can put it in here. But I just wanted to pause and talk about centering equity in the world of grant making and grant writing. And I want to look at it from 2 sides. The first question that we want to be asking ourselves when we apply for a grant is, where is the money coming from, right? So in the United States, by and large, if a family foundation, a corporate foundation, a religious institution, an academic institution has a lot of money to give away. Somewhere in their past, probably, not all the time, probably, right? There is historic inequity and exploitation in that wealth building. So just being honest with yourself, with your constituents, we are going to apply for this grant. It is from this family foundation. The history of this family foundation is that, right, they made their money through the exploitation of workers. In that same breath, I will say that a lot of foundations exist because there is an awareness of this historic inequity and exploitation. And many foundations, right, are trying to do some sort of restorative work, reparative work in the community by giving back. So this can be a thing that makes a foundation more attractive to you as a grantor, or it can be a thing that makes a foundation less attractive to you as a grantor. But really doing that research, knowing where your money comes from, because you're going to have to talk about the fact that you cashed that check at some point. Corporate foundations are also often looking for a tax break. Again, case-by-case basis, is it wrong to take money from a corporation, even though they don't seem to really care about what they're doing with their philanthropic dollars? No, of course not. But for your project, for your group, is this particular corporation not one from whom you should take money, right? If your whole nonprofit is around saving the seals, you're probably not taking big oil money, just because it doesn't fit, and it's going to be very difficult for you to sort of narrate your ethics around fundraising and development. So just looking, click on those about links, do your research. Who are these people? Where did they get their money? Why are they giving it away? Also, state and federal taxes, government grants, that's coming from your pocket, that's coming from your community. And then social impact investment groups. So this is a trend that has gained a lot of popularity in the last 10 to 15 years. Social impact investment groups, they're known by other names. Basically, it's groups of people who are not fabulously wealthy on their own, but they get together to pool their resources, because with the theory, right, is that like I can give $5,000 to a cause that I believe in, but if I get together with 10 other people who have $5,000 that they want to give to it, and we all believe in the same cause, $50,000, like that could really move the needle on a situation in a community. So that's what a social impact investment group is, if you come across that. And so maybe that's a great reason to align yourself with a funder. And those sorts of groups also often offer more than just money. They offer community, training. So these are just some sort of like different things we might find when we dig into where the money is coming from. The takeaway from this question is, will your community partners and the people you seek to serve be honored by the source of the grant? And then practically, how will it feel to list this granting organization on your website, right? The money might be great, but you don't actually want Enron's logo on your website. So just kind of a pragmatic piece of that puzzle. The second part of sort of the other way to look at equity and grant making and grant writing is asking the question, does my project raise money to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? And again, I think in our current world, we kind of get numb to what those three words mean, what those three words ought to mean in the world of grant making. But I think it's pretty safe to say that all missional and philanthropic work at some level should seek to remove barriers and restore justice, right? We're not trying to create more problems for people. We are not trying to make the world less just. So when you're asked that question in an application, you don't need to make something up. All you need to do is say, okay, yeah, like how does this work remove barriers? How and for whom? Are we going to do something just for our community? To that point, when Lou Lou's nonprofit, right? It doesn't really serve homeless teens. It's not so much focused on unhoused teenagers. 95% of the kids who come to Lou's events are housed. So it would be disingenuous for Lou in a grant application to say, like, the reason that I'm really passionate about this and that we're going to do this is for all of those unhoused teenagers. That may be so, but it would be instrumentalizing a vulnerable population to kind of tell that sort of fib in a grant application. It is good enough for Lou to just say, this is for teens. 95% of my constituents are housed. They're 5% unhoused. Yes, care about them too. But that's not the reason that we're doing this. We're doing this for everybody. And so, just being careful that what we say in our grant applications is actually true. And that we're not using a vulnerable population to increase the likelihood that we'll receive money. I don't know why it does that. I'm so sorry. And then just sort of the last question, will a short-term project leave anyone out in the cold? Am I going to start a project and then, when it's over, this need that it was filling and people have learned that they can depend on it, and then it's going to go away completely. And I have no plan for how I could continue it after the grant period. So is that a good reason not to do your project? No. Sometimes we start a project not knowing where it will go and not knowing how we will continue it, but just being really mindful, right? That we don't create more problems than we solve. So the takeaway here is really sitting down with your grants team and asking, do we understand our motivations for engaging in this work? And are we creating more barriers than we're removing? All right. And then the last time that we meet, we are going to be getting into the really dry world of structure planning and execution. In short, there are some tools that make this work a lot easier. Google Drive is the best free service on which to host your documents that you're building with your team. You can do spreadsheets. You can have folders that hold all your PDFs. As long as you don't have some sort of ethical opposition to working with Google, that's a really good resource. Dropbox isn't free, but if your organization already pays for a Dropbox account, you might just find that you prefer their document sharing options. Excel, so spreadsheet building, navigating spreadsheets. Sometimes organizations will just ask you to make up a spreadsheet, right? But sometimes they provide one and you have to know how to use it. And if you don't, that's a real bummer. My best skill isn't Excel and spreadsheets. And so, yeah, that can be tough when you're up against a deadline and the little fields won't do what they're supposed to be doing. And then Adobe or Preview. So you're going to want to have some sort of capability for PDF creation and also for combining documents. Sometimes funders will ask you to upload multiple documents and only allow for a single upload. That's when you need to be able to put those puppies into one PDF. Also signing letters or electronic transfer paperwork, being able to do signatures is really handy. Adobe makes a free scanning app that you can put on your phone. If digital signatures aren't really your thing, you can print out all your paperwork and do what you need to do, and then you can, and those will become PDFs. So that's just a little fun tip. Planning. So again, learning efficient co-working habits. Checklists are good. Everybody agreeing on like, these are the steps and this is how we're going to do them. Calendar management, agreeing on deadlines. This is when we are going to turn this in. But I think the most important part of efficient co-working is workflow. That Lou can say to Emilio, you build the budget, then I'm going to write the budget narrative. Because if both of them are waiting for the other one to do it, right, then it never happens. So I'm getting really good at talking to your team about who's going to do what, when, and who's in charge of what, and how you will communicate to one another to let each other know that things are ready or you have questions to ask. It sounds simple, but I find a lot of people just don't take the time to talk to each other about what's the best way you work and what's the best way to communicate with you. And then we're, pulling back a little bit and talking about a sustainable grants program. So realistic budgeting, conservative timelines, making sure that you have the support of your community, really simple things that we can do to sort of start a grants program where we are writing multiple grants in a year, finding the RFPs, crafting the narrative, making the budget, turning them in on time, right? And then hopefully getting them. So we will go through sort of, what are the best practices for building a sustainable grants program, and then some development strategies. So at the end of these 4 sessions, Lou should have a grants team. He should have a very clear sense of his project. He has identified, right, 5 funding opportunities that his grants team is going to apply for in 2022. The narrative and the budget will be made, basic narrative, basic budget, so that they can kind of be retooled for whatever type of grant opportunity they're responding to. And then creating a reliable mechanism for co-working. These are the apps we use. These are the websites we use. This is the workflow. This is the procedure. It is going to make for a much more efficient co-working relationship, especially when folks aren't getting paid, right? Very often when we're at the beginning of our lives as grant seekers, when we are running nonprofits, we're not getting paid to do this. This is extra. Like this is this crazy thing called fundraising and development so often is not in our job description. So making it as easy on yourself as possible until such time as it can be. So this is sort of the end of my spiel. We have space for 12 teams. So you do have to apply as a team. We're not going to take single applicants just because as I've sort of gone through, the model itself works better if you have a sounding board within your organization that you can rely on. And to apply, I'm going to have y'all send the names and email addresses of each of your team members so we know who's going to, not just the organization that's participating, not just the church, but who the individuals are. And then your mission statement. So 2 to 5 sentences. What is it? Who are you? And then confirmation that you have budgets for your previous and current fiscal years. I'm not going to make you show your budgets to me or PRC if you do not want to, but just being able to say, like, we do have full reconciled budget from last year. We have our projected expense, P&L, profit and loss for this coming year. We can furnish those when the time comes in the workshop. If you have any questions about that part, though, if you've got last year's budget and you're like, I don't know, this is kind of a mess, maybe this will make them hate me, you can attach that, and Kate and Rhoda will take a look at it and let you know if that is what we're looking for. And I think, Rhoda, that is the end.
And if the budget is really where you're falling down, I will go ahead and plug that we have some workshops on QuickBooks coming up with our CPA at PRC. So if that's the part that's really stressing you out, those are coming up as well. So everybody feel free to send questions. I only have a couple here, so I will get started, but feel free to chat more questions my way to ask Susanna tonight. The first one, is there any kind specifically for grants to churches? Is there a magical directory to find these granting foundations?
Okay, there is no magical directory. You will find online that some, if you type in how to find grants into Google, the first things that are going to come up are paid databases. So that is absolutely something that your organization can invest in if you feel like your time is just worth more than these sort of this sort of deep spelunking that it can sometimes take to find a good grant opportunity. Here's what I'll say about those databases though. You'll have access to every grant that's available in the world, but you can't apply for every grant that's available in the world. You're probably going to be wanting to look at something that's particular. If you're a church, you might be looking in your denomination, right? You're probably looking in the United States, not necessarily. You might be looking in Lancaster, right, in your city, your county, your state. And so for local organizations, I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a great use of funds. Like I said, grants. So for nonprofits, grants.gov. Online philanthropy news sources, though, you can read the news and find out who's just opened up a big new fund. And that could be something that's relevant to faith communities or to nonprofits. So, I mean, this sounds silly, but philanthropy.com, like they just publish news stories about who is giving out money right now. Philanthropy News Digest.org would be another one. Sign up to get their newsletter. Google alerts, right? Like quotes, grants, plus, the thing that you're trying to do, plus church is going to turn up some things in the news that you probably wouldn't otherwise see. I'm a big fan of talking to other organizations who are similar to yours about where they get their grant funding. Maybe you have a colleague at a similar nonprofit or a congregation who is in a similar size city, right, to yours. And you could call them up and say, we're thinking about starting this thing. Have you got any money for this? Do you know anybody who's gotten any money for this? Here's why I recommend word of mouth. It's very common to come across. I just looked at one for somebody who has a small nonprofit out of a church today. And he said, this looks great. What do you think about this for our organization? And I read it and I was like, this looks great for your organization, but it's a giant national fund. And they're not listing any statistics about how many applications they receive and how many they award. And so I think that we can kind of fall down a black hole of big national funders where you can't see what they've funded. They're not publishing their annual report on their website, and they're not telling you how many grants they give or even the amount. And has anyone ever actually won this grant, right? So if you can find somebody who's actually received the grant in the past, that's a great starting point. If you're curious if a funder is right for you, you can kind of reverse engineer this and go onto the IRS website and look up their 990. So if somebody tells you about a funder and you're like, and you look on their website and you can't really figure out, would they give us money? Search their 990 on the IRS, pull it up, scroll down 3/4 of the way, and they have to list everybody they gave money to. So that could be a fun little web sleuthing thing. And yeah, short of buying into a database, I really think word of mouth is best. And then, giving yourself a time limit. Say, I'm going to spend 30 minutes on Google. This sounds so stupid, I know, and I'm really sorry, but it's true. There's really no substitute for just doing the legwork of what it is that you want to do. What are your, sort of, what are the headlines of who you are and what kind of grants can you receive? And I think you'd be surprised on what you can turn up. But it's not uncommon for me when I'm working with a client to have 50 tabs open where I'm just doing research really quick and opening every foundation website as I find it. And then I say, okay, that's enough. And then I go through and I read them all. Like, it's just part of the deal. That's when it's great to have a grants team, that there is somebody in your organization or at your church who loves this stuff. They love stalking people on Facebook and they love genealogy, right? Like, they just love computer-based research. Give it to that person.
A couple of questions kind of in the same vein of what type of things can be funded. For example, infrastructure type things for a church, maintaining building, like general operating funds for a nonprofit, as opposed to like launching a big new project. Just kind of the realm of what kinds of things can be funded.
Absolutely. The short answer is, if you can dream it, you can fund it. Grants are just very specialized often. So there is going to be a grant out there that is just specifically for general operating for, mystery theater companies. And that's all they do. So again, keyword searches are your friend, because most grants actually aren't open to everybody. Like, there is somebody who wants to give you money for what you specifically want to do. And the goal is just sort of putting that together. So you will run in, if you're looking for general operating, you open your 50 tabs, 40 of them will say, we don't do general operating, right? And that's where paying attention to the rules is really important. But 10 of them do. And in fact, 6 of them only do general operating. So general operating, absolutely, you just kind of gotta kind of sift through and find who are the organizations that actually want to do that. And actually for churches, the same goes for building. So a lot of religious-based grants, right, will tell you in the rules, like, we do not fund putting in bathrooms. We do not fund your new roof. In fact, you can't buy anything with this, right? Like, it has to only be ideas, which is infuriating. But then there are also going to be organizations that specifically want to restore church buildings, right? So yeah, getting really, really specific in your web searches, calling people who you've heard maybe got a grant for that. Also, if you stumble upon an organization that you are an 80% fit for, but there's just like 1 or 2 things that it's just not going to happen, see if their grants person will still meet with you. Describe what you're trying to do. And then when they smile and shake their head and say, sorry, we don't do that, then you say, who should I apply for a grant from? And usually they have a few people that they can send you to. So again, back to that relationship building, making the phone calls, sending the emails, kind of doing that legwork to figure out, like, who is the person that's giving out money for the exact thing that you're trying to do.
I'm kind of in the vein of what is available money-wise. Is there like a percentage relationship between what a grant wants to fund versus what they want your own organization to put up for a project, or other community funding to be involved at a certain percentage?
Not necessarily. There are grants specifically. So say you're really small and you come across a grant that actually gives grants to individuals and not organizations. That would be an opportunity for you as the ED, or the ED of an organization of one, or the pastor of a very small congregation, to be like, I'm just going to apply for this by myself, in which case usually no one has to kick in any more money, right? So that's an example of a grant where they don't even expect to see anybody else putting money into this because it's granting an individual's activities. Sometimes organizations will spell it out. Oftentimes they don't, which is sort of where I kind of, my rule of thumb is find community partners, right? Even if it's a silent partner, call that person in town and be like, can I put your name on this application? Can I just put it on here? And like, you don't have to do anything. Can you just be the person standing next to me on this application? And then, we're going to use your building, right, for one of the whatevers. And we're going to call that an in-kind donation of space. And we're going to value that at $700. Like, there is a lot of creative bookkeeping and creative storytelling that can go into helping a funder see that they should give you money. But yeah, that's what I'll say about that. There's no blanket rule. about these things. Hopefully the organization will spell out what it is that they're looking for from you. But if they don't, when in doubt, a little partner demonstrating what kind of labor you are going to put into this. Like, even if you're looking for $20,000 to start a complete new project and you want them to pay the whole $20,000 that the project is going to cost, are you hosting the activities from your offices? That costs money. So try to, give a fair evaluation of what the overhead is going to be on that project and say, that's what my organization is contributing.
A question about grant opportunities specifically for LGBTQ plus community. Are those foundations exist?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, this really goes back to, what I was saying about centering equity and instrumentalizing. So often, right, organizations will just sort of like add LGBTQ to the docket, right? Because that is something that the funder is looking for. And luckily funders are pretty wise to this and they can just look you up and find out if that's something that you're working on. But there's a lot of funding. I mean, we absolutely don't have time to go into particular recommendations. But I think I was just talking to Kate and Rhoda about a foundation that we were looking at. Was this Carpenter, Rhoda?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a foundation that we had been talking about that very, recently. Is it Carpenter Family Foundation or just Carpenter? Anyway, you could look, it's pretty easy to find, and they grant to Lancaster area. And very specifically, we're looking to give money to organizations that were benefiting LGBTQIA community. So they're out there. Yeah, absolutely.
That is the last of my questions that I have currently. Are there others that people are holding on to? We'll give you a little bit more of a chance to get them in. And if we don't have more tonight, we'll go ahead and end it. I will send out this recording as well as some of the notes that Susanna put together to everybody afterwards. I will also include the information for those of you who want to go a lot deeper with Susanna in the next 4 sessions and come out the other side with your grant applications put together. I will send that information as well so that you all can be in touch and move forward. And otherwise, I will go ahead and say thank you very much, Susanna. It was great. And oh, one question came in really quick. When is the cohort documentation due? So we don't have a hard due date. It's a little bit first come, first served a little bit. And then also the first meeting is in a month. So that's essentially the hardest of deadlines because the cohort starts. But the sooner the better, basically. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and hopefully we will see a bunch of you again on our cohort teams. Good night, everybody.